Well, you got me again. Yesterday, Bill Reeves told me that, he said, you know, Michael, we never know what's going to come out of your mouth, but we know it'll be entertaining. He says, we don't even know if it's true, but at least you keep it entertaining. So that's how it works with me. And, you know, I just want to say how grateful I am that you invited me back. I was trying to figure it out. I've been to and spoken at least half of the CASETA conferences. And last year I was Jason Schoen. That was the name tag I was wearing. But I'm very grateful. I woke up feeling very blessed to be invited here, and thank you, Tam, and thank you, Howard, and the board, and so on, for indulging me in some of the things that I do and say and go on about. Because one of the things I've learned about myself is I'm fairly intense and fairly passionate about things, and Texas art is one of those things. I woke up at 3:30 this morning, and part of that's I can lay at the feet of George and Beverly Palmer and Jason Schoen, because they made me eat seafood about 10 o'clock last night. And remember, where I live in West Texas, seafood is made by Mrs. Paul's. And so with the chiles verdes and the avocado, let's just say I woke up a little earlier than I had planned. So 3:30 came along, and I've learned, as I've gotten older, and now that I'm a grandfather, to listen to the still small voice. And the still small voice says, you're up now, take advantage. And so I went for a walk at 4:30 this morning, and went walking down towards Herman Park. And at 5 o'clock I was standing under the archway where Sam Houston's sculpture is, and I sat on those steps for a half an hour. And I am very blessed and grateful to be part of this great state. I'm very proud of my Kansas roots. I am indeed. However, the fact that I got to Texas as fast as I could in 1985, I've lived in Texas longer than any other place in my life, and it's a great blessing to sit on those steps this morning and realize the great responsibility that those of us who talk about Texas art have on our shoulders. A.C. Cook always used to say, we are merely caretakers for a short time of these treasures over which we speak and examine and so on. And that's what I was thinking this morning at 5 o'clock. There's not a lot of people to talk to at 5 o'clock in Herman Park, because the street folks, they're sleeping. And I think even the muggers were still asleep, so that's good. But it was absolutely gorgeous. It was a beautiful morning, and paying respects to General Sam was a highlight of my life. And I live these days one day at a time. That's the only way I can live. And I just want to thank you all for the opportunity. I'm not going to talk about this, but I would like to point out that, did everyone hear what Mark just said, that Amarillo, Texas is the Center for Modern Art in Texas? Y'all heard that? Now, he said it, and that's important, because remember, you've had 4 scholars who talked during this conference, and then you got me. So it's important that you take from the scholars, Katie, Mark, Mr. Fox, Randy Tibbetts. I mean, those are real scholars. I just hang pictures, and glorified picture hanger is what I am. I hope you put the Arpa things on fairly soon. Not fussing here. I get that. I brought my little cigarette lighter thingies and everything. You know, that you plug into the box. I know. The lantern slides always look better for me. Okay, so this is Jose Arpa here on the left. He was an associate of John O'Neill when he came. Well, let me just regale you. This week has been very interesting in my life as a Texas art historian and a Texas historian, because now that I'm curator of art and Western heritage at Panhandle Plains, I wear lots of different hats and not just a cowboy hat. My week started like this. On Tuesday, I did a lecture on Comanches, the history of the Comanches at the Amarillo Public Library. And next Tuesday, I'm commenting on the new film that's been rediscovered, one of the earliest films with an all-native cast, allegedly with all of Quanah Parker's children as the cast members. And I'm going to be on the panel that's discussing that. On Thursday morning, I was finishing up my continuing ed class on George Catlin. That evening, gave the acceptance speech for Madonnas of the Prairie, and then I flew to Houston after sitting in the Amarillo airport for 7 hours while they bound the rudder back onto the plane with a baling wire. And so I was really hoping that when I got up here, I'd remember what it is I was supposed to talk about. So if we start talking about Buffalo Hump or something like that, you'll have to correct me because I'm not really sure where I'm standing today. All right, here we go. In 2012, and yesterday I didn't move around too much, so I hope can you hear me? Okay. My kids say Dad always projected real well, so I walk around a lot when I talk. In 2012, Panhandle Plains had organized an exhibition called Texas Impressionism, branding with brushstroke and color. And it traveled the state, going to Abilene, Tyler, San Antonio, and concluding at Beaumont. I believe that was in many ways a groundbreaking exhibition, not because I put it together, but because it happened. And one of the lessons from that exhibition, and one of the things that rose to the top, was that Jose Arpa was far more influential and important to Texas painting than we thought before, because with all due respect to the Onderdonks, Mr. Onderdonk was not the teacher that Jose Arpa was, nor did he have the track record in terms of the effect that his work and his teachings had on early Texas art. So, what I thought I would talk with you about today is the fact that, first of all, Jose Arpa was a Spaniard. That's very important, and that's important to the talk today. He was in Texas, we believe, from 1899 to 1932, not always in the state. He moved around quite a little bit between Mexico, Texas, and going back to Spain. I am not an Jose Arpa expert, but I am a curator of art, and it's my job in putting together an exhibition that will tour the state beginning in the spring of next year is to put together a survey exhibition on Mr. Arpa. The authority on Arpa is Kate Sheeran. Kate spoke here at CASETA, I'm not sure how many years ago. She's also co-curated an exhibition currently at the San Antonio Museum of Art called The Three Worlds of Jose Arpa, or something along those lines. I encourage you to go see it. It's also important that we remember that Harry Half put together an exhibition in 2010 in his gallery, and in 2008, the San Antonio Art League did the same. But as far as I can determine from the historical record, there has not been a Jose Arpa retrospective in probably about 90 years. It's long overdue that we look squarely at this Spaniard that came to Texas and what he brought to the table. And that's basically the gist of my talk today is, what did Arpa bring to the table that was different from French Impressionism that we talked about extensively in the Texas Impressionism exhibition, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. It's important that along this journey that we all remain open-minded, and I don't know everything about Arpa, as I told you, I'm full disclosure, but I have been working on Arpa since at least 1996, when two curators at the University of Seville were putting together a Jose Arpa exhibition that took place there at the university. And there was a great deal of correspondence. I still am a little puzzled why people contact me, because in '96 I was still pretty wet behind the ears as far as this stuff goes, but nevertheless, I've been working on Arpa since '96, so I've learned a thing or two about a thing or two. Now let's see if we can work the little dealy here. There we go. Spanish art has its basis in Catholicism, primarily in the illustrations in, as you can see, in illuminated manuscripts, and also pages on vellum or parchment that help explain the stories of the Bible. I know this sounds fairly basic to many of you, but it's important that we understand that. Spain was a Catholic country, and Catholicism, Christianity, is vital to the understanding of the Spanish art tradition. And so these things like this, including altar pieces, and this is in fact, you push the center thing for the pointer. Oh, whoop, whoop. Top, okay. This is actually a part of one of these panels that came out of an altarpiece in Mexico that we own at Panhandle Plains. We think she's probably from the 16th or 17th century, St. Catherine, as you can see. So that tradition, which comes down through most European countries who were Catholic, very much informs Spanish painting. The first major painter who's recognized in the Spanish Renaissance tradition is Luis de Morales, and you can see one of his paintings here. Now, what you see beginning here is a particular type of depiction of these scenes that we see throughout art history and dominates Spanish painting for the next several hundred years. And first of all, it's the darkness of the palette. You need to remember this, the darkness of the palette and the almost abject tragedy that comes through in Spanish painting. What Sorolla would talk about later about the sadness. So we need to be aware that that tradition informs Jose Arpa as he eventually makes his way to Texas many, many years later. Zurbarán, moving forward from the Spanish Renaissance into the Baroque period, you can see how dark their paintings are. They're gloomy, they're sad, as Sorolla would tell us. Ribera coming forward, nearly always dark. And of course, the primary mover and shaker from Italy to Spain was Caravaggio. And you can see in this particular painting how dark they are. But the other part that informs not only Italian painting, but especially Spanish painting, is the emphasis on the real human figure. That even though these are stories from the Bible, somewhere disconnected from us, real people survived and lived through these times. So the use of a real model, if you've never seen a Caravaggio painting in person, you owe it to yourselves to do that. I was fortunate in that I got to see the deposition when they brought it to the National Gallery when I was still in D.C., and it was just flat amazing because you could see the dirt on his feet. And so that's important to the Spanish tradition as it was to Italy, and Caravaggio is the model. He's the bar that was set for Spanish art that would come. El Greco, of course, and this is a little bit of an art history lesson, but I think it's important that we remember these Spaniards. Having gone to SMU, Spanish art was a major part of my education there. I also worked with Dr. Tufts, Dr. Eleanor Tufts when I was there. And so these Spanish artists are very much part of my own upbringing. And so El Greco's part of that, again, still in that religious tradition, but also bringing something new, especially with the shimmer that comes through in his metallic paints. All of these things are working towards informing. And of course, the giant among all of them is Velázquez. You can see in this Bacchanal, and also especially the Las Meninas portrait. And notice the top one, right? The self-portrait of Velázquez as he peeks around from this enormous and giant canvas. Very important that we recognize that, because that is something that's very much part of Jose Arpa's output, is the number of self-portraits that he did. The Spanish still life tradition with Melendez and others is also part of this, and these all come together in what you're about to see. So this is, I guess, as you understand, this is an art history lesson a little bit, because sometimes the Spanish tradition is shoved off to the side. Most art history survey books these days might mention a handful of the Spanish painters, certainly not comprehensively. And you know how they feel about American art. You know, that's kind of beyond the pale. And you get into Texas, that doesn't even exist. It's not even in the index. So it's important that we understand that. And of course, Goya, nice collections there at SMU, but that I got to see. But Goya is very much part of that tradition, moving into the 19th century. And then Murillo, still continuing in the Catholic Christian tradition. And this is transferred into the colonies that are established in Middle America, Mexico, and in South America, these same traditions. And you see high-quality paintings like this. This is actually in our collection, Spanish Colonial Mater Dolorosa, very much in the Murillo tradition. And these were highly skilled people who were coming into Mexico. So there was sophisticated painting happening in Mexico for a couple of hundred years before Arpa even arrives. So, and then eventually there is a sort of a naive school that develops as you get further and further away from those trained artists. The naive painters do make these retablos that you see in Reredos and Bultos and so on, emulating and doing the best that they can with very little training to continue those traditions. Guadalupe here, and of course borrowing from more sophisticated paintings that we've seen before. So, 1874, in February, a group of French painters get together and do an exhibition that eventually is known as Impressionism. Of course, the critics were mortified. They thought this was just sloppy or lazy painting, really didn't know exactly what to make of all this nonsense. Clearly, these artists were not very sophisticated, and they were just trying to get by and trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. This is, of course, something that's repeated over and over and over again as we move into the modernist canon. And, of course, here in Texas, I'm going to lend this to Mark and Katie and everybody because this is a great, great slide. I show this in just about every lecture. I can find a way to wedge it in there because this is how it is out here, of course. You know, we don't know what to make of this stuff. Because Tom doesn't understand modernism, and he sure didn't understand Impressionism. Because remember, and as you heard me when I did my lecture in 2012 on Impressionism, in June of that year, there were buffalo hunters who were fighting Comanches and Kiowas at Adobe Walls while all these sophisticated things were going on in France. So it's important that we understand the context. After some initial angst, eventually Impressionism catches on in the U.S., and then you have a group of artists who come to be known as the Ten, who start exhibiting together and espousing that Impressionist aesthetic. William H. Gertz, I think he did address you all a few years back, or certainly gave a lecture at the DMA about his sort of formula for what constitutes an Impressionist painting. High-keyed colors, short brush strokes, comma-like brush strokes, painted on plein air and all those other things, plunging perspectives, largely due to photography, and also to Asian printmaking and so on. And these guys, like Childe Hassam in Washington Square Park, Frank Benson, oftentimes depicting female models in gardens at leisure, and especially Thomas Wilmer doing the same sort of things. Dewing's women are always dancing about doing stuff the rest of us really can't connect to. And William Merritt Chase, who's played a great role in our understanding of Mr. Onderdonk, Julian Onderdonk, through the work of William Rudolph, who was the co-curator on the exhibition at SAMA that I encourage you to go see. But one of the things that gets a little skewed as we learn about Impressionism is that it did spread all over the world, not just to the United States, and certainly didn't just stay in France. This is a German Impressionist painter, and also in Spain. And the Spanish version is different. The old saw is that Renoir allegedly once said the reason they put blue in the shadows is because they ran out of black paint. Makes for a great story. I don't know how true it is, but nevertheless, that is one of the characteristics that you do see in Spanish painting is the heavy use of black. Even in Impressionist paintings like this by Martin Rico, painting in our collection. And Rico plays a large role in what Arpa would do after he comes here. And even, believe it or not, Impressionism makes it all the way to Australia. Does anybody see, now this painting is about 7 by 9, 7 by 10. Does that look vaguely similar to something you all are familiar with? Yes, Mr. Ray was responsible for Australian Impressionism. Very clearly, I don't think there's any doubt. So, back to Impressionism. So it becomes all the rage. By the middle of the 1890s, it's pretty well dominating the globe. By about 1895, that's pretty easy to see. But what's happening in Texas, of course, is it's a little bit different, and it's slower to develop. This is, of course, the Adobe Walls painting by John Elliott Jenkins, Frederick Remington's episode of the Buffalo Gun at the MFA here in Houston, and, of course, Richard Patry's what's sometimes known as the Target Indian, which I believe belongs to the Amon Carter. So it's important that we keep things in context. There were Texas artists who didn't necessarily go seeking instruction in Impressionist painting because it wasn't necessarily taught in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And we heard about one of them, E. Richardson Cherry, and also Dawson Dawson-Watson. These are actually paintings done of the Académie Julian studios, one of the small studios around Paris where Americans were somewhat welcomed. Because the École des Beaux-Arts was, in most respects, was too difficult for Americans to enter into. And so the Académie Julian was very accommodating, and it was an international studio which included Russians, Swedes, Spaniards, and so on. And so this is the milieu that Americans found their way into. And I think it's also helpful for us to revisit what Texas artists were doing when Jose Arpa gets to the stage. This is E. Richardson Cherry. Thanks, Randy, for the photograph. This is her watercolor of Giverny and her eventual friend and colleague, Dawson Dawson-Watson, who gets to Texas we believe roughly by about 1914, painting the same corner as Giverny. And as you can see here, Randy, thank you for this, by the way. Always like showing this comparison. It's just majorly cool. And Randy even has a photograph I didn't put in here. And of course, they're seeking to at least be close to the master Monet, who didn't necessarily take students. Theodore Robinson is probably the only American who had any sort of a student-teacher relationship with him. But I think there's a certain kinship by just being in the same town or the same vicinity that these Texas artists were trying to soak up. And I cannot prove it, but I believe Mr. Ray probably went to Giverny. John Elliott Jenkins was there, and it's very interesting to me is that Jenkins, Dawson Dawson-Watson, Cherry, and Ray are all at Giverny between 87 and 89. And of course, they were all plotting on how to take over the Texas art scene, which they eventually would do. Mr. Ray, of course, did Impressionist paintings, as you can see from this little painting, Stampeding the Herd. But he also showed the influence, and we'll just use his as an example because you knew I'd get to him eventually, the effect of Japanese printmaking on his work, which I've shown before, and also filtered down to his students, like Elo Griffith here. Seymour Thomas was also in Paris at about the same time, an expatriate, but when we would come back to San Antonio in the late 90s, he'd do field sketches and plein air paintings like this. Lucien Abrams, of course, many of you saw the exhibitions that we had a couple of years ago. He was an expatriate living in France for a good deal of his career until he returns to Old Lyme, Connecticut, but always maintained his Texas roots and connections. And of course, Julian Onderdonk, who never quite made it to France, but of course was a student of William Merritt Chase. And the scumbled brushwork, cursive-like check marks that you see in the foreground, and not quite the high-key palette that the true Impressionist would use. And so therefore, in my opinion, Onderdonk's work is more of a hybrid between the Barbizon school, tonalism, and Impressionism, sort of all bounded together into one. And thank you, Sue, yesterday for going to bat for that spectacular painting that you all have of Southwest Texas. I mean, what a treat that was to see. And of course, Chase is a monumental figure in Onderdonk's career, including his work in New York, thanks to James Baker for his new book. And of course, this is similar to, but not the same painting that Sue had. I promise I didn't rob it without permission. This isn't yours. And of course, this Barbizon foggy effect, very much in keeping with what the tonalists were doing in and around Old Lyme, Connecticut at about this same time. And then we get here. So, Jose Arpa is born at Carmona, Spain, near Seville, and studies at Seville at the School of Fine Arts there. And he studied, here's where he's born. This is what his town looks like, at least today. And this is where he studies initially with a historical painter following the academic method. Remember, the academic method is the human figure is the basis for everything. And so we start drawing from plaster casts from the human figure, usually plaster casts taken from Greek and Roman sculpture. We draw from the parts, we draw from the heads, the hands, and so on, eventually to the full-scale figure. And eventually we move on to drawing from the human figure, not picking up paint yet, and it's a slow and painstaking process. And one had to earn your stripes as you worked your way through this methodology. Eduardo Cano was his primary instructor, and he was a history painter. And of course, this becomes a combination of older traditions of history painting informing and being informed by traditions from the past, and we talked a little bit about that yesterday in our sculpture talk, about the effect of bringing mythology, historical events, historical figures in terms of pose or subject and clothing them in the guise of something more contemporaneous. That's, of course, from the British tradition initially, from the discourses of Sir Joshua Reynolds. And so that history painting becomes the template throughout much of the 19th century until those young Turks out of France come along. Martin Rico, whom I mentioned before, is a heavy influence on Arpa. Not necessarily as a direct teacher, but certainly being around his paintings. This is an early Martin Rico, as you can see. But you will recall these lavanderas is something that will reoccur in Jose Arpa's work, as you'll see down the road. But this is what he's best known for. And these were hugely popular in the United States because one could, like you can go to Paris today and buy a little painting on the quays from a bouquiniste or something like that. You can call them whatever you want. You can call them souvenirs, but Rico made a very good living selling these type paintings in the U.S. as mementos of visits to Venice. And unfortunately, the worst curse you can lay on an artist is to be popular, because you know if you're popular, you must not be any good. So unfortunately, up until recently, Rico's been relegated to the back catacombs of most art museum vaults, thanks to some work that, in fact, the Meadows Museum did in resurrecting a better and more critical look at Rico's work. We start to appreciate the work that he did. And this is a spectacular painting. We actually acquired this at Panhandle Plains from a Wichita Falls ranch woman. And it hung on the wall next to a George Ennis. So he was highly appreciated in his time, latter part of the 19th century, and had a great effect on what Arpa would do when he gets to Texas. However, it's Joaquin Sorolla y Bastida, which I think is one of the great names in art history, by the way. Just say that several thousand times. It's just cool. Y Bastida. I mean, I'm telling you what. So, and I don't know if how many of you got to see the Sorolla show at Meadows Museum. I kicked myself because I didn't, because he's one of my favorites. And William H. Gertz, who's sort of the grand poobah of American Impressionism, talks about how important Sorolla was internationally. He was a rock star, absolute rock star in the U.S. in particular by 1905, and that held serve at least for the next 10 years, because his work's not only shown in New York, it's shown in Chicago, it's shown all over the place, and they're tours de force. They really are. Especially paintings like this. I mean, man alive, that's slopping some paint, brother. And I mean really, as someone who aspired to be a painter before I realized that I don't have that burning thing in my gut to make a piece of art today or I'm going to die, I learned that I was an historian, because my thing is I got to learn something about art or history today or I'm going to die. I would love to be able to push paint around like that. And if you did not see it, try to see a Sorolla whenever you can, but a heavy influence on Arpa, and especially this man too, who gets somewhat short shrift largely because his lifespan was relatively short. But I want to read a quotation from one of Bill Gertz's many books on American Impressionism about Mariano Fortuny. He says, "The peculiar technique of many of the modern Spanish painters and their loose manner of handling color must in a great measure be ascribed to Fortuny." Now again, his lifespan was relatively short, and I'm going to show you an example of his picture here, but thanks to Randy Tibbetts, I think we can finally solve a mystery that in fact Acapulco Boy by Lloyd Goff is not just a testament to being one of those guys. It's in fact an art historical reference and therefore a history painting. So clearly this is an homage to Mariano Fortuny, and he's added his own little Lloyd Goff twist, as he often would, but I think it's important that we recognize that Lloyd Goff was very knowledgeable about the effects of Spanish Impressionism on his own work, because remember, Lloyd Goff started out as a Frank Ray student, so therefore I think we can put this one to bed. Randy, you can put that in your pie chart. That Fortuny can be part of this discussion. Anyway, Fortuny's work, as you can see, that heavy saturated light, and it's not the heavy impasto that we necessarily see with Sorolla, but it's a different kind of that Mediterranean light. And the only place that I know of really where one can find that light is in New Mexico and in West Texas, because it's what O'Keeffe and some others referred to as the faraway nearby. It's very deceiving, and that kind of light only occurs when you get away from places. With all due respect, I love Houston, but I'm telling you what, I'm dying here, man. How do you breathe this air every day? Remember, our relative humidity is about 15% out there. Man, I'm going to have an afro by the time I get back home. Anyway, Fortuny was a heavy influence on all kinds of different painters, so I think we need to pay homage to that. So, a few survey images of Jose Arpa while he's still working in Spain, and it's important to understand that he wins the Prix de Rome 3 times. 3 times. Most artists never won it once, which means he eventually studies in Rome for 6 years. So he's highly cosmopolitan before he ever gets to the Western Hemisphere. So, Here's one of his paintings. If you look at the treatment of the overall canvas, you can see a little bit of all three of those people I just mentioned, Fortuny, Sorolla, and Rico, and you'll see that as we go through here. This is something that relates very closely to some of the paintings many of you are familiar with from his Texas period, and especially associations with Dawson Dawson-Watson, with whitewashed buildings, and of course the Ugly Kid painting, which he paints after he gets to Mexico, roughly about 1899, we believe. He's invited to, no, I'm sorry, 1895. He's invited to submit paintings to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Let me back up just a second. World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which most scholars recognize as really the nadir of American Impressionism in the U.S., because the writers like Hamlin Garland, who were very much part of promoting American Impressionism as a distinct form of Impressionism, all comes to a head at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, and Arpa submits paintings there, 4 paintings, according to the record, and a couple of years later is invited, probably because of that international notoriety, invited to come to Mexico City and teach at one of the schools there. There are different stories from the record that tell us why he chose not to accept that position. But eventually, by about 1900, he's in Puebla. And this is one of his paintings, very much in the historical tradition. And this is the way it looked before it was conserved. And I so appreciate, again, what Sue said about conservation. And I'm going to say a little commercial about that, if you don't mind. I know a lot of you, and a lot of you call me and ask me questions about different artists, and that's fine, and I appreciate that. But I'm going to fuss at you for just a little bit. There are people who are certified by the American Institute for Conservation of Historic Works. Just because someone can tell you that they can get that darkened glaze off an Eisenlohr painting doesn't mean you should, okay? Anybody can say they're a painting restorer. Just because you can get by on the cheap, remember what AC told us. You are a caretaker, and you have a responsibility to do it with the most top-flight professional you can get. And believe me, there are plenty of people out there who hang up a shingle and say they can restore your picture for you. Don't do it. Shake out your wallet, blow the dust out of it, and make sure you do it the right way. And it's expensive. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. It's expensive, and Sue touched on that yesterday. It often prevents us from showing paintings we'd love to show, right, Sue? All the time. So remember, just because you can do it cheaply does not mean you should. That's the end of my fussing at you. Okay, so we know that this painting is hanging in this wonderful photograph, and I appreciate Bonnie and the Nows for allowing me to show these photographs. It's hanging here in the, let's see, right up here. This is what it looks like. Some of you who went to the Nows deal last night, you got to see it in its great glory. And it's a spectacular and very important painting, but it's painted in Mexico. But it's very much part of the Arpa story. And it's certainly very much in keeping with this tradition of painting the interior of the artist's studio, because by this point in American art, and especially in world art, the artist is seen as a sophisticate and has things in his studio to show you his level of sophistication. Objets d'art, books, fine carpets, draperies on the walls, well-dressed people, because this is how the artist wanted to be seen, and therefore what better way to advertise your level of sophistication than to make a painting about that. Okay, and so this is what I believe Arpa was doing with the painting on the right. And he continued that tradition. As you can see here in this wonderful painting, not only does this artist a collector of fine tapestries, decorative art objects, but also a collector of paintings himself. And probably not his own, because most artists are wonderful about swapping works of art, and they're in many ways, those are some of the more fascinating stories that we can learn. For example, we own a Charles Umlauf painting that belonged to William Lester and sat on top of the hi-fi. You know, I learned that the other day. That's pretty cool when you learn that kind of stuff. And of course, that's very much in keeping with the Chase tradition, who did a lot of this sort of studio interior things throughout his career. having been trained as a history painter, it stands to reason that Jose Arpa would do history painting as well. One of his versions of this particular plague scene, certainly in keeping with the tradition of Goya, and certainly giving a nod throughout his career to his Spanish roots, because it's important that you continue to remember he was a Spaniard. And that Spanish tradition is firm and solid in many ways. One of the areas that I work in, as an aside, is northern New Mexico. I've been working on the Taos Art Colony for as long as I've been working in Texas art. I know that's blasphemy for most of you all, and I'm sorry to admit it, but yes, that's true. Northern New Mexicans in particular like to believe that they're far more connected to the mother country than they are to Mexico, and they will tell you that many of them believe themselves still to be Castilian, for example. So those traditions are very strong, and that Spanish pride, I believe, comes through Arpa's work regardless of where he was hanging his hat. This was very useful by the collector who shared both the photograph on the left and the painting on the right of his work in Seville. Now, I don't think we can actually categorize his work as only from before he goes to Mexico, because remember, he's back and forth quite a little bit. And I don't think we truly understand how much these artists move their paintings around. Remember, these are precious things to them, and moving them back and forth throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. Remember, Americans would move lock, stock, and barrel to go live on the continent for a while, taking all their furniture and everything else, dogs, cats, big Spanish or Chinese vases, and so on. John Singer Sargent helps us know that through his own paintings. This painting's actually hanging out there in the trade booth area, so I encourage you to go look at it. Lady in Mantilla, certainly very much part in of that Spanish painting tradition. And of course, the still life, which I mentioned before, very, very much part of the Spanish tradition, particularly with dead game, which we see, and of course these memento mori scenes. Not terribly large part of Arpa's oeuvre, but certainly included. This is where he was initially supposed to work, but declined this particular appointment. And of course, it taught the academic method, a la the French method, filtered through Spain. Much of Arpa's Mexican work is immensely powerful. Lavanderas here, as you can see, in a private collection, one of my favorites. And when I first saw it, I think I saw this first on a postcard, and I about had a heart attack because I thought this was one of the great American Impressionist paintings I'd ever seen. And of course, this is probably the landscape from which he did the field sketch to eventually do this painting, more than likely. Probably painted in the area near Puebla. This too is from that region, and that connection to adobe architecture, stucco architecture, which would move north into Mexico and into California and other places he went, is something that appealed to him from his native town of Carmona. This is Las Lavanderas from the Meadows Museum collection, a field sketch, and you can see how loose and wonderful his plein air sketches were. And still in Mexico. I had to crop this drastically because the former owner of this evidently doesn't think good photography is vital to one of these exhibitions or these lectures, and so I'm fussing at, and he knows exactly who he is. But I did the best that I could. This is actually one of 3 paintings that Panhandle Plains owns by Jose Arpa, and we always have to start with our own collection. These were all acquired in the 1920s by a gentleman from Farwell, Texas, named James D. Hamlin, and Judge Hamlin was actually the legal representative for the Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company, the company that worked for the Farwells to build the Texas Capitol. And he became an art collector both in Taos and Santa Fe, but also collected downstate. And we're darn lucky that we have these 3 paintings, all of which you'll see today. This Spanish doorway, as you can see here, this is Espada, correct? Is that right? And I believe, and of course we like to make these great leaps, we art historians, and then try to figure out how to make it fit. Was Arpa thinking perhaps of some Monet work that he'd seen? I don't know. But he certainly was familiar with church architecture that he'd seen in Mexico, both in Chihuahua and other places. And this is another example with a handy photograph, thanks to the owner. He was fascinated by architecture throughout his career. working both in watercolor and also in oil. This is the quarry in San Antonio, no longer owned by the person who owns this, but still a great painting. This belongs to Bill and Linda Reeves, one of his works that, to me, reminds heavily of the influence of Martin Greco, especially in the treatment of the water. Dappling that water is almost impossible for the painter to give it that movement, that vibration that you need for it to read like water. And clearly, Arpa knew what he was doing, learning at the feet of the master, Greco. But he becomes known for many of his hill country landscapes like you see here, often with buildings. And the way I interpret these is the buildings become the mediating figure in a lot of ways, because rarely do humans show up in these hill country landscapes with sheds and barns and so on. Arpa gets to Texas, we believe, roughly about 1901. Cecilia Steinfeld says that he appears in the San Antonio newspapers by 1901. But we do know that he didn't stay. We also know that he probably exhibited at the International Fair in San Antonio as early as 1899, but not necessarily a Texas resident. And I keep emphasizing this, that he continued to move around. It wasn't until probably about 1923 or 1924 when he becomes a semi-permanent resident of San Antonio, but still continues to move around in Mexico and also in Spain. He wins the last, in the Davis competitions, he wins a prize in the first two, both for landscape paintings, but he wins this, when they finally added the cotton fields category in 1929, Arpa wins the grand prize for cotton pickers, which belongs to the San Antonio Art League. And when I saw this painting, I've always thought about the effect of movement as well as the truncated figures are extremely modern. But when you compare them to what we know about Sorolla, especially his skill and mastery of showing the moving figure, especially on beaches or in gardens, to me, I'm struck by the fact that clearly Arpa, I believe, was being influenced by the great Spanish master. Again, not necessarily training with him specifically, but certainly being influenced by him. He takes a trip up to Wisconsin and paints the Mississippi River in watercolor and also in oil. And Prairie du Chien, as you can see up in Wisconsin, quite spectacular, which means he can slop his brush wherever he wants to and still be a master wherever he goes, including Grand Canyon. Balanced Rock appears both in watercolor and also in oil. And this is our Grand Canyon painting. It's a 24 by 20, so a good size. In 1925, he exhibits most of his Grand Canyon paintings in his Western landscapes at Babcock Galleries in New York. By this time, he's starting to enjoy a great deal of fame, not only in Texas, but specifically in America, showing in various places and also showing his students' work. He goes out to New Mexico and makes a large body of work at the Hopi Pueblos, including Oribe, Walpi, and some of the others, both in watercolor and also in oil. So a true Southwestern painter, very much like the regionalists would always claim, that while we are Texans, we are also part of the greater whole in the Southwest. And I so appreciate Mark bringing that up about how those connections are all over the place, especially in the Southwest. This is possibly near Sanderson. Possibly. That would be my best guess. Because it does look like that out there if you've never been out there, but that'd be my best guess. But quite a spectacular painting. As you can see, pure landscape, no figures, no buildings, just pure landscape, and he was quite good. But this is probably what we know best, is Arpa as the landscape wildflower painter. Julian Onderdonk is usually credited as the guy. Remember, Julian doesn't get back to Texas until about 1909. By this time, Arpa is in and out of Texas for close to a decade. I'm not trying to pull anything away from Julian Onderdonk. That's not it. But Texas Impressionism, the exhibition, tells us a very, very different story about the influence of whom on whom, and I think we need to give credit where credit is due. This is our Verbena painting. It's a small painting, about 16 by 20, and I'm proud to say, I'm not going to continue with commercials about Panhandle Plains. When I got there, we had a hell of a collection. We just made it better. And this was already there. This is another one of the Hamlin Gets. This was probably one of the stars of Texas Impressionism, and quite frankly, I was pretty surprised. I've always loved this little painting, but it has the things that you want to see, especially in the foreground with an Impressionist painter. And of course, remember, the Californians get all the credit for being Impressionists. Y'all remember that. But one of the characteristics that you will see in Arpa's landscape paintings, particularly with the wildflowers, is he will smear and drag his brush across the middle ground. Now, Onderdonk would do that too, but less expressively. Does that make sense? It was usually a much shorter stroke. He would do that, blending that, but in the middle ground on an Arpa, especially when he was painting things, in my opinion, more for sale than exhibition, because remember, I don't curse these people for having to sell their paintings, because they had to put beans on the table. And so I'm not saying this is a potboiler, but I think you will find that more likely in some of the smaller, more, like the cabinet bronze, a smaller, more appropriate size for a home, like this one. But this one's an especially good one. And you'll notice in the last slides that I've shown you the use of the diagonal. Do you all see that? That's a high characteristic of Arpa, and this is a painting in a private collection in Dallas, quite spectacular with, as you can see, prickly pear in the foreground, these wonderful rock outcroppings and Texas wildflowers as they appear naturally. One of the spectacular things. That's the proper response. Thank you very much. Quite spectacular, but it's all this plunging perspective stuff is almost exclusively due to photography. We know that from Dr. Gertz's excellent and different books that he's published on Impressionism, and also especially from Japanese art. This is where it comes from, and not every artist adapted this to their own work. And so very clearly, this was something that Jose Arpa wanted to convey to his students, including Carl Hoppe here on the right, Horse Mint. As you can see, this is Arpa here. That plunging perspective, there's the Arpa barn, which we'll call it just for shorthand. That's Horse Mint again by Hoppe. Probably the best Hoppe I've ever seen, I'll be honest with you. This is Rolla Taylor. Certainly one of the best Rolla Taylors I've ever seen. Plunging perspective yet again. There it is again, Rolla Taylor. And remember, we love him, right? But Rolla wasn't always on, right? This is Rolla Taylor. This is Prickly Pear, belonged to A.C. Cook. I don't know who owns it now, but it's one of my favorite Texas paintings. I saw it in 1990 at the Museum of Fine Arts in Abilene. And one of the artists that doesn't get a lot of attention as being an Arpa student is Porfirio Salinas. This is Road to Hondo, which is my favorite Salinas of all time, because when you stand in front of it, and if you stand there long enough, the dirt will actually fall off this cut bank right before your eyes. It really will. It's just a flat amazing, and that's all due to Mr. Arpa. That's all due to him. One of the great pleasures of being an historian of art is being able to correspond with people around the globe, especially thanks to the internet. About a year ago, I was contacted by a young scholar at the University of Seville named Carmen Rodriguez, who is currently writing her dissertation on Mr. Arpa, finally giving him credit where credit is due. And she wrote a lovely article for a symposium that was held about a year ago on artists of the Seville School. I've asked Noe Perez, I can read Spanish, but you don't want me to read it out loud. To give dignity to Mr. Arpa as it should be given, I've asked Noe Perez to read this quotation. It's just a paragraph from Dr. Rodriguez's article, if you'll indulge me. And what I've asked Noe to do is read it in Spanish, translating it into English for us, and then I will interpret from there. So I think it's the appropriate way to pay homage to Jose Arpa by doing this. So Noe, please.
Esta es la esencia pura de José Arpa, la búsqueda de la luz, la búsqueda del instante, la búsqueda de la intensidad cromática y la plasticidad. Un empeño que llenó toda su vida y que sin duda consiguió plasmar con sus pinceles. Basically, she's saying this is the pure essence of Jose Arpa, the search for light, the search for the instant, the search for the chromatic intensity and plasticity, a task, a journey that filled his life and that he, without a doubt, was able to achieve through his brushes.
Thank you, Noe. I believe, as a Spaniard, it's absolutely vital that we remember that. And Dr. Rodriguez's writing there is absolutely lovely and beautiful and right, and I feel it's only to be really heard in Spanish. That's why I asked Noe to do that, and thank you very much for doing that. With all due respect to Thomas Kincaid, this man is the painter of light, and when he gets to Texas, this is what his search is about. The painter, he's looking for, as Noe translated for us beautifully, thank you. He's looking for light and that intensity that only the Impressionist painter searches for and tries to apply to the canvas. In a particular way, we're using particular colors, and it's the search and the journey that I believe defines Jose Arpa. Whether that took him to Spain, an area near Seville, to Mexico, to New Mexico, to Arizona, and especially here to Texas. This is what he says to us. I am on a journey, I am on a search, and here is what my researches have revealed. And he puts them on canvas for us. And I've always been struck by the fact that Jose Arpa never shirks in his self-portraits. He doesn't turn away. There are self-portraits that are highly sensitive, and I'm not saying his self-portraits are not, but his self-portraits in particular, to me, speak volumes about the fact that he was a Spaniard. And what better way to conclude than to remember the great Spanish painter in many realms, in most people's opinion, was Diego Velázquez, who challenges us in his own self-portrait very much like Jose Arpa does. Now, that upward tilt of the chin that they both have is a characteristic that you will see in certain portraits. To me, that speaks to the power and especially the passion that only the Spanish painter can bring to a particular subject. And that's what I hope to accomplish in the exhibition that we will send on its way next spring, is by assembling those parts of Jose Arpa's journey, those parts of his search for light and color and brushwork and life in the exhibition next spring. Thanks. Wait a minute. Don't leave. Don't leave. Don't leave. We historians have to look for opportunity. And I didn't ask permission to do this, so if I make somebody mad, I'm sorry. There's a painting that's absolutely historic that's in the, whatever you call that area, the exhibit area. I don't know what Howard's fixing to do, but I'd like, if you are interested, I would like to go up and speak with you about Frank Ray's Sheepherder's Camp for about 10 or 15 minutes, because it's the last great one, and I'm not playing with you. I've been studying Frank Ray for 30 years. That's the last great one. I don't shill for anybody. I don't care who buys it. I don't care who sells it. But if you're really interested in Texas art, we need to share information, and I have an obligation to you because I've been working on that. And Peter, is Peter here? Okay. Peter, of course, is going to help me because he's put together a magnificent exhibition that opens at the University of Texas in the fall. He's worked his tail off for the last several years, assembling and herding cats on, I don't know how many authors you've got, 5 or 6, on the exhibition catalog. And we have an opportunity with that Sheepherder's Camp in this building, and I feel like I need to share things with you. So if you're interested, I'm going to be up there in front of the painting. Come talk to me, and I'm going to talk at you for a little bit. So thanks.